The iron bolt slid home at exactly midnight, and Vaela realized with a cold, sinking certainty that her stepmother had never intended for her to reach the bonding ceremony at all. She pressed her palms flat against the tower door, feeling the ancient wood thrum with the locking enchantment Helaine had woven into it. Not a simple lock, not something she could pick with a hairpin or break with her shoulder. This was old magic, the kind that fed on desperation, that tightened the harder you pushed. 3 floors below, the great hall of Ashenmere Keep was being draped in silver and moonflower garlands. 500 guests from every territory in the realm were settling into their seats. And somewhere among them, the Alpha King himself was waiting for a bride who would never walk down the aisle. Vaela sank to the cold stone floor and pressed her forehead against her knees. She should have seen it coming. Helaine had been too calm all week, too accommodating. She had smiled when the seamstress delivered the ceremonial gown, had even complimented the lacework at the collar, and Vaela had wanted so badly to believe that 6 years of cruelty might end with something as simple as acceptance. Foolish. She had been so painfully foolish. The tower room was small and round, barely 10 paces across, with a single narrow window that looked out over the northern cliff face. It had been a storage room once, before Vaela's father died, and Helaine converted it into what she called the reflection chamber. A place for Vaela to sit and think about her behavior whenever she displeased her stepmother, which was often, which was always. Vaela knew every crack in these walls. She knew the draft that crept under the door in winter. She knew the exact angle of moonlight that fell through the window in each season, because she had spent hundreds of hours in this room, locked away while the rest of the keep carried on without her. But tonight was different. Tonight there was a ceremony. Tonight there was a king. She had never met him. That was the part that made her chest ache with something between fury and grief. She had never once laid eyes on Alpha King Theron of the Iron Crest bloodline, had only heard the stories, the rumors, the whispered legends that traveled from territory to territory like wildfire. That he was young for a king, that he had taken the throne after his father's betrayal nearly shattered the realm, that he was brutal in battle and unnervingly quiet in court, that no one had ever seen him smile. The bonding had been arranged by the council, not by Helaine, which was the only reason it had been arranged at all. The Ashenmere territory owed fealty to the crown, and with Vaela's father dead, the bloodline claim fell to her. The council had determined that a bonding between the last Ashenmere heir and the Alpha King would unite the fractured northern territories and end 3 years of border skirmishes. Helaine had no legal ground to refuse, so she had smiled. She had nodded. She had helped Vaela into the ceremonial gown just 2 hours ago, lacing the back with her own fingers, and Vaela had stood very still and tried not to flinch at her stepmother's touch. "You look adequate," Helaine had said, which was the closest thing to a compliment she had ever offered. Then she had sent Vaela to the tower to wait until the processional music began, and lock the door behind her. Vaela lifted her head and stared at the window. The drop was sheer. 100 feet of rough stone cliff face falling to jagged rocks and the churning Ashenmere River below. No ledges, no handholds, no escape. She was still wearing the ceremonial gown. It was beautiful, she had to admit. Ivory silk that caught the moonlight like water, with sleeves that tapered to points at her wrists, and a train that pooled behind her like a silver tide. Her dark hair had been braided with tiny white flowers that were already beginning to wilt in the cold. She looked like a bride. She felt like a prisoner. A distant horn sounded from the great hall. The processional. The ceremony was beginning, and the aisle would be empty, and 500 guests would turn to watch no one walk toward the king. Vaela closed her eyes. She could picture it. The whispers starting. The shifting in seats. The Alpha King standing at the altar, watching the empty doorway, his expression unreadable. And Helaine, seated in the front row, pressing a hand to her heart with practiced concern. Oh, where could she be? She was just here. I dressed her myself. Something must have happened. Perhaps she changed her mind. Perhaps she ran. That was the story Helaine would tell. The frightened girl who fled rather than bond with the fearsome Alpha King. It would humiliate Vaela. It would void the council's arrangement. And it would leave Helaine in control of Ashenmere for another decade, free to drain the territory's coffers and starve its people while Vaela rotted in this tower, until everyone forgot she existed. Vaela pressed her fists against the floor until her knuckles ached. No. She stood. She crossed to the window and leaned out into the night air, letting the cold hit her face, letting it sharpen her. The wind carried the faint sound of music from below. Strings and drums, the ceremony beginning without her. She opened her mouth and screamed, not a cry for help, not a delicate shout. A full, raw, tearing scream that ripped from her chest and split the night air like a blade. She screamed the name of the territory she was heir to. She screamed the injustice of it. She screamed because she had spent 6 years being silent and obedient and small, and she was done. The sound echoed off the cliff face and scattered into the dark. Then silence. Vaela gripped the windowsill, breathing hard, her throat burning. The music below had stopped. She didn't know if anyone had heard. The tower was on the far side of the keep, deliberately isolated, deliberately forgotten. She waited. 1 minute. 2. 5. Nothing. She turned away from the window, pressing her back against the cold stone, and slid down to sit again. The gown pooled around her like spilled milk. She stared at the locked door and tried to think, tried to plan, tried to find some crack in the cage Helaine had built around her. Then she heard it. A sound that didn't belong. A scraping, rhythmic and deliberate, coming from outside. From below the window. Vaela's breath caught. She scrambled to the window and leaned out, peering down into the darkness, and what she saw made every thought in her head go perfectly, completely silent. A man was climbing the tower, not with ropes, not with a ladder, with his bare hands. He was halfway up the cliff face, finding grips in stone that shouldn't have offered any, hauling himself upward with a controlled, powerful efficiency that was almost hypnotic to watch. His fingers dug into cracks that Vaela couldn't even see. His body pressed close to the rock, muscles shifting under a dark, formal tunic that was clearly not designed for scaling walls. She could not see his face. Only broad shoulders, dark hair, and hands that gripped the stone like it owed him something. He climbed another 10 feet in the time it took her to remember how to breathe. "Who are you?" she called down, her voice raw from screaming. He didn't answer. He climbed. 20 feet below her now. 15. 10. His hand reached the windowsill, and Vaela stepped back as he hauled himself up and through the narrow opening with a grace that should have been impossible for a man his size. He landed on the tower floor in a crouch, one hand braced on the stone, and lifted his head. Vaela's heart stopped. She had heard that Alpha King Theron had gray eyes. She had heard that he carried the Iron Crest features, the sharp jaw, the proud brow, the kind of face that looked carved rather than born. But no rumor, no whispered description, no second-hand account could have prepared her for the reality of him looking directly at her from 3 feet away, breathing hard, his knuckles scraped raw and bleeding, his formal tunic torn at the shoulder, with an expression on his face that was not anger, not irritation, not the cold detachment the stories promised. It was relief. Pure, staggering, knee-weakening relief. As if he had been afraid, genuinely afraid, and the sight of her standing here alive and whole had just pulled the ground back under his feet. "You screamed," he said. His voice was low, roughened by exertion, and it rumbled through the small room like a drumbeat. "I heard you scream." Vaela opened her mouth, closed it. opened it again. "You climbed the tower," she whispered. "You screamed," he repeated, as if this explained everything, as if there had been no other possible response to the sound of her voice than to leave his own ceremony and scale 100 feet of sheer cliff face with his bare hands. He straightened slowly, and she had to look up. He was tall. She had known he would be tall. The Ironcrest bloodline was known for it. But knowing and experiencing were different things entirely. He towered over her, filling the small room with his presence, and she could feel something radiating off him, something that wasn't heat exactly, something deeper, something that pressed against her skin and made the fine hairs on her arms stand on end. Alpha energy, raw and unshielded. Most alphas kept theirs leashed in polite company. He wasn't leashing anything right now. "The door," Vaela said, finding her voice. "My stepmother. She locked it. There's an enchantment." He turned his head and looked at the door. Then he walked to it, placed one hand flat against the wood, and pushed. The enchantment shattered like glass. Vaela felt it break, felt the magic splinter and dissolve, and the door swung open so hard it cracked against the outer wall. The stairwell beyond was dark and empty. Theron looked back at her. "She locked you in here." It wasn't a question. His tone had changed. The relief was still there. Underneath, but layered over it now, was something colder. Something that made the air in the room feel like the moment before a storm breaks. "She was never going to let me reach the ceremony," Vaela said. She was surprised by how steady her voice sounded. How calm, as if her hands weren't shaking. "She wanted it to look like I ran." Theron's jaw tightened. She watched a muscle flex in his cheek, watched his gray eyes darken until they were the color of iron, and she understood with sudden, absolute clarity why people feared him. "How long?" he asked. "How long what? How long has she been doing this to you?" The question landed like a fist to her sternum. Not because it was aggressive, because it was quiet, because his voice had dropped to something almost gentle. And gentleness was so foreign in this tower, in this keep, in her life, that she didn't know what to do with it. 6 years, she said, since my father died. Something moved behind his eyes, something that burned. He held out his hand. His knuckles were bleeding. The skin was torn and raw from the climb, and he held his hand out to her anyway, palm up, steady as stone, as if the pain was so far beneath his notice that it didn't exist. "Come with me," he said. Vaela looked at his hand. She looked at the open door behind him, the dark stairwell, the path down to the great hall where 500 guests were waiting, and Helaine was sitting in the front row perfecting her lie. She put her hand in his fingers closed around hers, and the touch sent a jolt through her body that she felt in her teeth. Warmth. Not just physical warmth, though his skin was hot against hers, but something else. Something that started at the point of contact and spread through her like sunrise, like the first breath after nearly drowning, like coming home to a place she had never been. Theron went very still. His eyes dropped to their joined hands, then lifted to her face, and the expression on his features was one she would remember for the rest of her life. Shock. Recognition. Awe. "It's you," he breathed. She didn't understand what he meant. She didn't understand the way the air between them seemed to thicken and hum, the way her heartbeat was suddenly louder than the wind, the way every nerve in her body was pointing toward him like a compass finding north. But she felt it. Whatever it was, she felt it too. He led her down the stairs without releasing her hand, and his grip was firm, but careful. The kind of hold that said, "I will not let you fall," while leaving room for her to pull away if she wanted to. She didn't want to. The stairwell spiraled down through the keep's north wing, past locked rooms and dusty corridors, and Vaela realized he must have mapped the keep's layout in his head before the ceremony, must have known exactly which tower held the north window when he heard her scream. The thought made something warm and dangerous unfurl in her chest. They reached the ground floor, and the great hall doors loomed ahead of them, tall oak panels carved with the Ashenmere wolf crest, and behind them, the muffled sound of 500 confused and whispering guests. Theron stopped. He turned to face her, and in the torchlight of the corridor his gray eyes were molten. "When we walk through those doors," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear, "you walk beside me, not behind, not following, beside. Do you understand?" Vaela nodded. "And your stepmother," he continued, and the temperature of his voice dropped 10 degrees. "What would you have me do?" The question stunned her. He was the Alpha King. He could do whatever he wanted. He could have Helaine dragged from her seat and thrown in the dungeons without a word of explanation. He could strip her of her title, her lands, her name. He had every right and every power to handle this however he saw fit, and he was asking her. "Let me speak first," Vaela said. "Let them hear it from me." Something flickered across his face. Not surprise exactly. Something warmer. Something that looked like respect. "Then speak," he said, "and I will make sure no one silences you again." He pushed open the doors. The great hall erupted. 500 faces turned toward them. The whispering cut off like a severed cord, replaced by a silence so total that Vaela could hear the candle flames guttering in their holders. Helaine was standing in the front row, her face arranged in an expression of maternal worry that would have been convincing to anyone who didn't know her. But Vaela watched the color drain from her stepmother's face in real time as she took in the sight of them. Vaela in her ceremonial gown, unbroken and unbowed. The Alpha King beside her, his tunic torn, his knuckles bloody, his hand wrapped around hers. Vaela felt the entire room's attention settle on her like a physical weight, and for one terrible second, the old instinct surged, the one Helaine had trained into her through 6 years of locked doors and cold silences. Be small. Be quiet. Don't cause a scene. Theron's thumb brushed across her knuckles, a tiny gesture, a barely perceptible sweep of warmth. She straightened her spine. "My name is Vaela Ashenmere," she said, and her voice carried to every corner of the hall. "Heir to this territory, daughter of Lord Cassian Ashenmere. And I was locked in the North Tower tonight by the woman who was supposed to present me at this ceremony." The silence cracked like ice breaking on a river. Whispers erupted. Heads turned toward Helaine. "She locked the door with an enchantment," Vaela continued. "She intended for me to disappear, for you to believe I had run, for the bonding to be voided, and for her to maintain control of Ashenmere and everything my father built." Helaine's composure shattered. "That is a lie. She is confused. She has always been fragile, prone to fits of imagination. I would never—" "The enchantment residue is still on the tower door," Theron said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The room went so quiet that Vaela could hear the heartbeat of the man beside her, steady and sure. "My trackers confirmed it when I climbed past the wards. 3rd floor, north wing, a containment seal keyed to your bloodline, Lady Helaine. It will take my mages approximately 4 minutes to verify the caster. Would you like to wait, or would you prefer to save us all the time?" Helaine's mouth opened, closed. Her eyes darted to the exits, but Vaela could see Theron's guards had already positioned themselves at every door. Not with aggression, simply with presence. Walls of muscle and authority, standing casually, watching calmly. He had planned for this. Between hearing her scream and climbing the tower, between breaking the enchantment and walking her to the great hall, he had given orders. He had anticipated exactly how this would unfold, and he had moved every piece into place so smoothly that Vaela hadn't even noticed. "She will answer to the council," Theron said, and his voice carried the kind of finality that didn't invite argument. "She will answer for 6 years of it, if that is what you wish." He looked at Vaela when he said it. giving her the choice again, laying his power at her feet like an offering and waiting for her to tell him how to use it. Vaela met Helaine's eyes across the hall. She saw fear there, real fear, for the first time in 6 years. The woman who had locked her in towers and starved her spirit and told her she was nothing was finally afraid. "The council," Vaela said. "Let it be done properly. Let it be done justly." Theron inclined his head. 2 guards stepped forward and escorted Helaine from the hall, with a quiet efficiency that allowed no scene, no drama, no final manipulative appeal. The doors closed behind them, and Helaine was gone, and the air in the hall shifted like a pressure valve had been released. The officiant cleared his throat from the altar. Shall we proceed?" Vaela looked up at Theron. He was already looking at her, and the iron had faded from his eyes, and what was left was soft. Impossibly soft for a man who had just scaled a cliff face and dismantled a conspiracy without raising his voice. "Only if you want to," he said, quiet enough that only she could hear. "You climbed a tower for me," she whispered back. "I would climb a mountain." He said it without flair, without performance. A simple statement of fact, delivered in the same tone he might use to say the sky is blue or the river flows south. She searched his face for pretense, for political calculation, for any sign that this was the strategic Alpha King making a smart alliance. She found nothing but a man looking at a woman as if she were the first real thing he had ever seen. "Then yes," she said. "I want to." They walked to the altar together, side by side, exactly as he had promised. And when the officiant spoke the bonding words, Vaela felt them settle over her like warm rain. She spoke her vows clearly, and Theron spoke his in that low, steady voice. And when the officiant asked them to seal the bond with a touch, Theron simply lifted her hand and pressed his lips to her torn, tower-scraped knuckles with a tenderness that made 500 guests hold their breath. The bond snapped into place like a golden thread drawn taut between their chests, and Vaela gasped because she could feel him. Not just his presence, but his emotions, pouring through the connection like light through a prism. Relief, wonder, a fierce, almost painful joy. And beneath it all, a protectiveness so deep it had no bottom. A silent vow that had nothing to do with the words the officiant had spoken, and everything to do with the man who made it. She looked up at him, and he was looking at her, and his gray eyes were bright. "There you are," he murmured, and she didn't know if he meant in this moment or in his life, or in the bond that was singing between them. But it didn't matter. She felt the truth of it in her bones. Here I am. The weeks that followed were a revelation. Vaela had braced herself for the politics, for the strangeness of leaving Ashenmere for the Ironcrest capital, for the overwhelming reality of being bonded to a king. She had expected formality and distance, the kind of practical arrangement that alliances produced. 2 people sharing a title and a territory, but living separate emotional lives. She had not expected Theron to be quiet. Not cold quiet. Warm quiet. The kind of quiet that came from a man who listened more than he spoke, who noticed things, who showed up in small ways that accumulated like snowfall until one day you realized you were standing in the middle of something vast and soft and changed. He brought her tea in the mornings before the court assembled. Not because she asked, because he had noticed she reached for the kettle first thing on their second day together, and had simply started doing it himself by the third. He walked with her through the capital's markets on her first day, not as a tour, but as company, staying close without crowding, letting her set the pace, answering her questions about the city with an attentiveness that made her feel like her curiosity mattered. He told her about his father's betrayal on the 4th night, sitting on the floor of their shared chambers with his back against the bed and his eyes on the fire. And his voice was so carefully controlled that Vaela could hear every crack he was holding together. She sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched, and she told him about the tower, about the cold, about the years of being made small. He turned his head and looked at her, and the firelight caught the moisture in his eyes. And he said, "You are the least small person I have ever met." She kissed him. She hadn't planned to. She hadn't even finished processing his words before her body moved, before her hand found his jaw and her mouth found his. And the kiss was clumsy and fierce, and tasted like salt because one of them was crying and she wasn't sure which. His hand came up to cradle the back of her head, fingers sinking into her hair, and he kissed her back with a careful intensity that made her chest ache. Not desperate, not consuming, deliberate. As if he was memorizing her. As if he wanted to get this right more than he had ever wanted to get anything right. The bond between them blazed like a struck match, and Vaela felt his emotions flood through her. Tenderness so sharp it was almost pain. Disbelief that she was here, that she was real, that she had chosen him, and underneath it all, burning steady like a furnace, a love so fierce it frightened him. She pulled back just enough to see his face. His eyes were closed. His hand was trembling in her hair. "Theron," she whispered. He opened his eyes and they were silver. Pure, luminous silver. The color the legend said an alpha's eyes turned when the bond was fully realized, and Vaela had read about it in books, but had never believed it was real. "I have been waiting for you," he said, "for a very long time." 3 months later, Vaela stood on the balcony of the Iron Crest Palace and watched the sunrise paint the mountains gold. The council's judgment on Helaine had been delivered 2 weeks ago. Stripped of title, stripped of lands, stripped of every thread of power she had wrapped around herself like armor. Ashenmere had been returned to its people, with a steward Vaela had chosen herself. A woman from the territory who had known her father, and who wept when Vaela gave her the seal. The border skirmishes had ended. The northern territories, seeing the Ashenmere heir bonded to the crown, had laid down their grievances like old weapons, and for the first time in years, the trade routes were open and the roads were safe. Vaela still dreamed about the tower sometimes. She would wake in the dark with her heart racing and the phantom sensation of cold stone under her palms, and before she could even draw a full breath, Theron would be there. Not startling awake, not jerking upright, simply shifting closer, his arm tightening around her waist, his lips pressing against her temple, his voice a low rumble in the darkness. "You're here. You're safe. I'm here." Every time. Without fail, as if some part of him never fully slept, as if some wolf instinct kept watch even in dreams, waiting for the slightest tremor in the bond that connected them. This morning, the dream had come and gone quickly, chased away by the warmth of him, and Vaela had slipped out of bed to watch the sunrise because she could. Because no one was going to lock the door. Because the balcony was open and the air was free, and she could stand here as long as she wanted, wrapped in a robe that smelled like him, with the entire kingdom laid out before her like a promise. She heard him before she felt him. The soft pad of bare feet on stone. Then his arms came around her from behind, and his chin rested on top of her head, and the bond hummed between them like a plucked string. "You left the bed," he murmured. The bed was offended. She laughed, leaning back into his chest. "Tell the bed I needed air." "The bed doesn't understand air. The bed only understands warmth, and the absence of warmth." He pressed his face into her hair and inhaled deeply, and she felt his contentment pour through the bond like honey. "I understand both. I prefer the one where you're beside me." She turned in his arms to face him. In the early light, his gray eyes were soft, still hazy with sleep, and his dark hair was a disaster, and he was looking at her with an expression that still, after 3 months, made her breath catch. As if she were the miracle, as if a man who had armies and a crown and the power to break enchantments with his bare hands had found his single point of wonder in a woman who had spent 6 years learning how to survive, being forgotten. "I love you," she said. She said it often now. It had been hard at first, the words sticking in her throat like thorns, because love had been a weapon in Helaine's hands, something offered and withdrawn, something conditional. But Theron had been patient. He had said it first, had said it plainly and without expectation, had said it the way he did everything that mattered, with his whole self, holding nothing back. And slowly, word by word, Vaela had learned that love could be safe. "I know," he said, and the smile that crossed his face was the one no one else ever saw. Not the political smile, not the diplomatic nod, but the real one. The one that softened every sharp line of his features and made him look young and stunned and grateful. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs tracing the curve of her cheekbones, and kissed her forehead with a reverence that made her eyes sting. "I love you," he said against her skin. "I loved you when I heard you scream. I loved you when I saw you standing in that tower in your ruined gown with fury in your eyes. I loved you when you took my hand and walked into that hall and spoke your truth to 500 strangers without flinching." He pulled back to look at her, and his eyes were silver again. That impossible, luminous silver that meant the bond was singing, that meant every wall between them had dissolved, that meant he was hers completely and without condition. "I will love you," he said, "when the towers are dust and the ceremonies are forgotten, and the only thing left is this, you and me and the sunrise." Vaela rose on her toes and kissed him, slow and deep, with the morning light pouring over them like a blessing. The bond blazed golden between their hearts, and the mountains stood witness, and the kingdom stretched out below them, healing and whole. She had been locked in a tower. He had climbed it, and they had walked out together into a world that was, at last, wide open.